White initiates with a solid, a dynamic move that opens lines for the queen and bishop, establishing central presence. Black mirrors White's central ambition with contesting the center and preparing piece development. White develops the knight to a principled move that attacks the pawn and prepares kingside castling. Black develops the knight to defending the pawn and contributing to central control. White chooses the Ruy Lopez with creating pressure on Black's knight and indirectly on the pawn. Black challenges the with, forcing White to decide on the bishop's fate. White maintains the bishop's influence with keeping the tension and potential threats alive. Black develops the knight to a solid move attacking the central pawn and preparing castling. White castles kingside, prioritizing king safety and connecting the rooks. Black develops the bishop to preparing for kingside castling and reinforcing the pawn structure. White centralizes the rook to supporting the pawn and preparing central pawn breaks. Black expands on the queenside with challenging White's bishop and gaining space. White retreats the bishop to preserving its influence and maintaining the pin structure. Black solidifies the center with supporting the pawn and opening the bishop's diagonal. White prepares for a pawn push, strengthening central control and supporting the bishop. Black castles kingside, ensuring king safety and preparing to mobilize pieces. White plays a prophylactic move to prevent potential kingside threats or knight outposts. The move the knight to a5 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to e6, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the pawn to d4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on b3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the queen takes on b3, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the rook to e8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to a4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White retreats the bishop to maintaining its scope and defending the kingside. Black pushes, challenging White's central pawn structure and gaining queenside space. White advances the d-pawn to initiating a central pawn break and opening lines. Black supports the central tension with reinforcing the pawn and preparing knight maneuver. White develops the other knight to reinforcing the central pawn structure and supporting the queenside. Black captures the pawn, opening the c-file and simplifying the central position. White recaptures with opening the c-file and challenging Black's pawn structure. Black develops the knight to placing pressure on the pawn and central squares. White repositions the knight to supporting the pawn and potentially eyeing. Black advances on the queenside with preparing to break through or gain space. White develops the bishop to aiming towards Black's kingside and supporting central control. The move the bishop to a6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to a4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the bishop takes on b5, executes a favorable trade, which enables the queen to b6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the bishop takes on c6, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the queen takes on c6, executes a favorable trade. This allows the knight on the b-file to d2, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the bishop to e3 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to d5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the knight to b4, significantly boosting piece coordination. which enables the bishop to f1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to f4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight on the b-file to d4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the e-file takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black plays a strategic move to restrain white's queenside pawn advances. White retreats the knight to, possibly preparing a repositioning to a more active square. Black recaptures the central pawn, opening the e-file and simplifying the position. White recaptures the pawn, maintaining central presence and piece activity. Black exchanges knights, simplifying the position but potentially opening lines for white. White recaptures with the bishop, reinforcing central control and activating the piece. The move the knight to e5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to c5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the knight to e2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to f6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the pawn on the f-file takes on b3 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the pawn on the f-file takes on b3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White repositions the bishop to, a defensive move to protect the kingside. Black develops the knight to, reinforcing central control and adding pressure. White places the bishop back on, aiming at the weakened kingside pawn structure. Black develops the bishop to, improving its scope and preparing for defensive operations. White centralizes the knight to, a strong outpost controlling key central squares. Black activates the rook on, preparing for potential pawn breaks on the open file. The move the rook to c1 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to b1, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to b4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to c1 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to e7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to b3 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the f-file takes on b3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the bishop to b7 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the rook to c8, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the queen to d2, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the rook takes on e4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the knight to f4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to g5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to d5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to f3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the knight to f4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Afterwards, the rook takes on e4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on b5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the knight to e7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to d3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to b4, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to a3 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to b4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to b1, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to h4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. whereby the bishop to f2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on f2 with check executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on f2, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the pawn to b3 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to b4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to h4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to e2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to g5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to d2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to h6, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures with, establishing a strong queenside pawn presence. White centralizes the knight to, targeting key squares and increasing pressure. Black develops the bishop to, a strategic move eyeing the queenside. White repositions the rook to, supporting the pawn on and preparing for queenside action. Black advances the bishop to, creating counterplay and challenging white's structure. The move the rook on the e-file to e2 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to b5, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the queen to a5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on c6, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the bishop takes on c6, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the bishop to d2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to b7, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight to e7 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to e5, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the bishop to d2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to g5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to h1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on d2 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on d2, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White places the bishop on, a centralizing move that controls important squares. Black activates the queen to, creating threats on the queenside. White exchanges bishops, simplifying the position and improving the pawn structure. Black recaptures with the pawn, creating doubled pawns but opening a file. The move the queen to c1 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to f2, activating the rook on an open file, paving the way for the pawn to d5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to d4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the d-file takes on e4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the f-file takes on e4 executes a favorable trade. This allows the rook on the e-file to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the rook on the f-file to c8 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to a6, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space, paving the way for the rook to e1, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the bishop takes on f1, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the king takes on f1, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the rook on the f-file to c8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to g1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White repositions the rook to, preparing for potential exchanges and central action. Black pushes the d-pawn to, challenging the center and opening lines. The move the rook on the e-file takes on c3 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn on the e-file takes on d5, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board, paving the way for the pawn to g5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to h5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to b6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to h1 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the knight takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black delivers a check with, forcing white's king to a less secure square. White moves the king to, improving king safety and preparing for future action. Black recaptures the rook, simplifying the position and maintaining central control. White recaptures the rook, equalizing material and centralizing the piece. Black captures the central pawn, opening lines and creating dynamic play. White recaptures with the pawn, maintaining central pawn presence and opening the f-file. The move the bishop takes on e4 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to d6, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the bishop to b5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to f8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to e3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to g6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to e5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen takes on a3 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to e3, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the queen to b4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to c5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to f8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to b5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to d8, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen to f6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to b8, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the pawn to g3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to h5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to g2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the bishop takes on g2 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on g2, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White moves the queen to, a defensive maneuver to protect the king. The move the pawn to g5 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to g6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to c4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to f5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the rook to c8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the rook takes on c8 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on c8 with check, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White develops the knight to, targeting black's king and potential weaknesses. Black delivers a check with, forcing white's king to move. The move the king to h1 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to g3, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to h6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the rook to e3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to d5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to e2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to f5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to h6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to f8, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the rook to c5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to b4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to h6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to d2, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the knight to, reinforcing the kingside attack. Black repositions the knight to, a strong central outpost. White captures the knight, winning material and simplifying the game. Black recaptures with the queen, maintaining central presence and piece activity. White activates the rook to, preparing to support the kingside attack. Black repositions the knight to, creating tactical threats and disrupting White's structure. White develops the bishop to, adding pressure to Black's queenside. Black activates the rook to, a defensive maneuver to protect the king. White delivers a check with, forcing Black's king to a passive square. The move the king to h7 by Black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the king to g7, claiming key space in the center, allowing the queen to c3 with check, forcing the enemy king to find safety, which enables the king to g8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to d3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to e6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to c5, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen to c3 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to f8, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the king to g6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Next comes the queen to g8 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit, whereby the king to h5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to e2 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the king to h4, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to f5 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to g8, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the bishop to d3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to a4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to g4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the h-file takes on g4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White develops the bishop to, reinforcing control and preparing for a decisive attack. The move the queen to e6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to e5, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Afterwards, the queen takes on e5, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the rook takes on e5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the pawn to g4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the king to g7 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on f5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White repositions the queen to, maintaining pressure and forcing concessions. Black moves the king to, seeking minimal safety. White captures the pawn, winning material and securing a decisive advantage.